Good evening, everyone. Can we just check that we are all muted? At the end, when we have questions, we will invite you to unmute as people put their hands up. But for now, can we just ask that everybody is on mute so that we can proceed? Okay, well, good evening and welcome. Thank you for joining us for this third and final Tutu lecture from the College of the Transfiguration for 2024. This evening, we are delighted to welcome Revd Seipati Ngcobo. Revd Ngcobo is hailing originally from Potchefstroom, but she's a long way from there now, via Gauteng. She ended up with us in the College of Transfiguration after discerning her call early in her time at high school. It took her a while from then to get to us, but she was with us around 2016 or so. And then from there, she was ordained as a deacon in the Diocese of Highveld before she moved to where she is now in the Diocese of Natal, where she was ordained as a priest in 2019. In that context, she ministers together with her husband, Revd Sizwe Ngcobo, and currently serves as the Rector of St. John the Baptist in Pinetown. She is the mother of 2 sons, and her interests include Theological Ethics, Womanist Theology, and Black Liberation Theology. Tonight, Seipati will be speaking on the topic Ubuntu as the remembering of power, a Womanist theology perspective. So I just invite you all to welcome her.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. May, and thank you everybody for the warm online welcome. It is such a privilege for me to be here tonight. Yeah, I never thought in my wildest dreams that today I would be here invited as a guest to speak to people who are like me. Who are constantly engaged in theological reflection. As we begin tonight, please allow me to begin with a few acknowledgements. The first one being that, of course, yesterday would have been the birthday of this gigantic spiritual leader and humanitarian, Archbishop Desmond Tutu. Yesterday, the 7th of October, he would have turned 93 years old. And we know that history attests to his legacy of being this prophetic voice that calls for justice and liberation in his lifetime. My presence here this evening is not only in response to this great initiative that the College of Transfiguration is involved in or has facilitated a space for, but it's because of my interest and intentionality in remembering and remembering Tutu's legacy. So I want to acknowledge that I'm in no way coming to you as a scholar of Tutu's theology necessarily, but I come into this conversation as a thinker, a contributor, a conversation partner alongside you. And like I said, it is my privilege to be here. So when I was asked to reflect or to submit a topic, my tentative topic that I chose to speak on was Ubuntu as a remembering of power, a womanist theology perspective. And I think that in a country such as South Africa, where leaders like Bishop Tutu or your Bishop Nkwanes or your Mama Albertina Sisulu, your Steve Bikos, people who were at the face to face with injustices of colonialism and apartheid and racism, who have now died, I think it's a pertinent question for us to ask ourselves, especially 30 years into democracy, what is power? In my attempt to unpack the concept of power while locating myself within the womanist framework, I must state clearly that womanist theology is a theology of liberation. emerging from the lived experiences of Black women who struggle against unique challenges of multiple and converging struggles due to race, due to class, due to gender, due to culture. Womanist theology is a contextual theology of liberation, and this theology does not limit itself or its discourse to the spiritual realm, but I think it actively engages, is engaged in addressing and dealing with humanity's system of suffering in an attempt to eradicate them. So although these lived experiences cannot be homogenized, they are the starting point of engagement in womanist theology. One of the transformative attribute of womanist theology is its pursuit for liberation of all people, a liberation that in very real terms unpacks the gospel of Jesus into living. Womanist theology critiques and challenges systems and hierarchies of domination in both society and in our own religious institutions. With that bit of background of womanist theology, I go back to my original question then. What then is power? It was Wendy Brown who contends that power is one of those things we cannot approach head on or in isolation from other subjects if we are to speak about it intelligently. So then in a sense, there is this fluidity to power as a concept that makes an explicit theorizing of this concept very difficult. But I find that language often helps us in understanding something of power as a concept. If we turn our eyes to the New Testament, this English word that we see as power is translated from the Greek dunamis, where we get words like dynamite, or we get words like dynamic. And looking at some of the places in which this word was used in the New Testament, this word power or dunamis often referred to mighty works or wonderful works. We see it being used in relation to Jesus, in relation to his miracles, power used in relation to the disciples, power as a sense of empowering by the Holy Spirit. And in this light then, power seems to link itself with acts of compassion in service to others, to set them free from their own sources of oppression so that people can be free to live transformed lives. And the implication of this word is that power is an activity or an action, simple or complicated, that leads to the magnanimity of one's freedom and causes to rise in others a sense of awe and wonder at this transformation that has taken place. I think that power in and of itself is neutral. If it is not taken up, if it is not used, it remains just the potential of an ability that might need to be, that might even never be actualized. For power to lead to anything, it has to be taken up. Now, in decades leading up to South Africa's transition from democracy, the concept of power was central to lived experiences of many South Africans. The power dynamics that existed as a result of colonialism, of apartheid, of racism, disempowered many people and denied them their right to self-determination, to land, resources, movement of movement of going somewhere, and even to the point of denying them the movement of their own bodies. This essentially then disrupted and disintegrated power by denying humanity their inherent dignity. Of course, for many African women, this disintegration of power was very unique. Kwakwi Lan, I hope I'm saying it correctly, reminds us that, you know, in her reflection of Mercy Odioye's work, she reminds us that the encounter between Western colonizing culture and indigenous cultures raised thorny issues pertaining to women's roles and women's sexuality. And she makes reference to issues such as polygamy, child marriage, veiling, female circumcision, and widowhood. And Puilan says, the subordination of women was often cited as symptomatic of inferiority of indigenous cultures and saving colonized women from their oppression, ignorance, and heathenism became an integral part of the colonial discourse. Shuttled between tradition and modernity, indigenous women were seen either as victims of male aggression or as pitiful objects of Westerners' compassion, close quote. One then can see that whatever power dynamics that existed prior to colonial encounter, the struggle of women or the struggles of women were so unique that they not only had to struggle and resist against racism and classism, they also had to struggle against sexism as well, even from their co-colonized brothers. I think we can draw multiple parallels as we look at Tutu's theology of Ubuntu and look at Womanist theology, because from both these theologies, power can be understood as this double-edged sword, where it serves as both a tool of oppression, but also has the capacity, means of liberation. And the church itself is an institution of power. On one hand, colonial and apartheid systems in our South African history, we see that wielded power to subjugate and control colonized people, often using religion or religious institutions and theology as a means of legitimizing this authority. And then on the other hand, from the same church, we then have people like Archbishop Desmond Tutu. We have BTL scholars such as Bani Pijana. We have so many people, womanist scholars who rise up calling for the church to be an institution of power that empowers people. So then looking at power with this critical eye means that the institutional church is always held up against the lived experiences of people. And wherever there are unjust systems within the church or within the society, our theological lenses seek to reclaim and redefine power towards justice. Hence, when we read the works of people like Dolores Williams or Fundiswa Ngcobo, they use their critical womanist lenses to assert that freedom must be holistic, because being free from one form of oppression doesn't necessarily mean that we are free from all forms of oppression. And in unjust systems of oppression, we find that both the oppressed and the oppressor find themselves somewhat caught up in this destructive power dynamics even, that dehumanize them. While the one who dominates may very well believe themselves to be human and free, the theological implications are that they have a distorted view of self as a supreme being. And this disintegrates humanity as equal beings made in God's image. This, of course, as we know, is very anti what was affirmed by Archbishop Desmond Tutu, that all people are created equally in God's image. This distortion of self and this wielding of power is a form of woundedness that calls us to perhaps flip the tables of power and seek to find ways to remember power. I think we can learn a lot from Archbishop Desmond Tutu and many other women and men who were at the forefront of fighting against injustices in their time. You will remember that they were using slogans such as "Matla kya rona, amandla ngawethu." And this slogan of power overtly recognized that racism, exclusion, injustice hindered and denied people inherent dignity. And this same slogan was part of a sort of remembering of power to those who were coerced into spaces of powerlessness. So wherever we see Tutu seeing or engaging with power as wielded against someone, or power as stripping someone of their dignity and their autonomy and the right to self-determination, his theology of liberation and his Ubuntu ethics would challenge oppressive power systems and power structures that upheld power as domination. Now, with this integration of power, I think a big challenge before us is, how do we regain a sense of power? Power in which all people are able to live out their own liberated lives, especially in light of the person of Jesus Christ. I want to lean on Tutu's Ubuntu ethics and even my own Anglican heritage as a form of remembering power. Now, regarding Ubuntu, at the core of Tutu's theology is this African concept of Ubuntu, which is defined as the essence of being human, or which he understands as the essence of being human. Ubuntu, oboto, affirms that motho ke motho kabatho, umntu ngumntu ngabantu. A person is a person through other persons. Thus, there is this interconnectedness and mutual dependency to our existence. From Tutu's perspective, Ubuntu is a form of relational spirituality that connotes the basic connectedness of all human beings. Now, this does not mean that this relational spirituality that it speaks of denigrates individuality. If anything, it acknowledges that yes, we are human, but being properly related in Ubuntu means that no one person is absolutely self-sufficient. And Tutu used the concept of Ubuntu as both a theological and ethical framework. So Ubuntu as sort of a path to reconciliation, a path to healing, especially for a very deeply wounded nation that we are. So whether or not this healing of our wounded nation has been achieved is something that I think is yet to be interrogated, and that history will inquire of us South Africans. Now, Tutu's ethics of Ubuntu, when we look closely, firstly cuts through or cuts across all lines of race, class, gender, and sexuality. So therefore, wherever oppressive power showed its head, Tutu would then step to the fore and call out the unjust. You will remember that when the ANC came into power in 1994, years later, reflecting on how the government had now become a source of oppression to the people, Tutu publicly called out the ANC, warning them to watch out. And today, 30 years into our own democracy, his voice echoes true, as many South Africans today are suffering as a result of irresponsible political leadership that has been life and justice denying for many, many people. Ubuntu ethics challenges traditional Western notions of power based on individualism and domination. So reflecting on apartheid again, we'll remember that Tutu argued that while apartheid says, and I quote, people are created for separation, people are created for apartheid, people are created for alienation and division, harmony and disunity, Tutu states, in fact, people are made for fellowship. That is to say, you and I are made for interdependency, close quote. So did you recognize that identity and relationship go hand in hand? And thus, when one is obsessed with individualism and self-achievement, it's viewed as something that counters Jesus's summons to discipleship, to essentially take up our crosses and follow Jesus. And for there to exist this form of domination and subjugation, often leading to our own contemporary injustices, is in an ethical sense to be anti-human. Tutu's Ubuntu ethics stands in solidarity with the oppressed. I think that deeply influenced by his Anglican heritage, Tutu's prayer life often informed his solidarity with the oppressed. From this altar of prayer or from this kneeler that we see Tutu having the power to rise up and stand in solidarity with the people. And advocating for a non-violent stance as a means to challenge injustice, Tutu was actively involved in the dismantling of violent power. We know that in our own history as South Africans, Tutu was instrumental in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, where many oppressed people came forward to lament their colonial and racial wounds. Tutu used his power, seeking out a sense of justice and peace. He named the colonial and racial wounds for what they are, but he also rejoiced with the people in key moments of celebration and lamented with the people in their colonial and racial woundedness. And I think this is because Tutu reframed God's power through viewing this cross of Christ on which Jesus hung as God's ultimate act of solidarity with the oppressed. Tutu's Ubuntu ethics was also justice seeking. Tutu's concept of justice meant not being neutral in situations of injustice. His drive for justice, as modeled in his Ubuntu ethics, seeks to deal with power imbalances and thus directly challenges the ideology of power as something to be wielded over others. Tutu strives for power with and power for the people, but never power against people. So when we then say that Tutu was powerful, we are actually affirming that Tutu was able to use his own power, his own capacity to act, and his own capacity to engage, and allowed himself to be active in the struggle towards liberation, a liberation in which all people of all race, class, gender, culture, and sexuality no longer view themselves as being without human dignity. So the call, matla ke ya rona, is in a sense a remembering of power that can challenge multiple injustices even in our present day. It calls us to envision new ways of exercising power, not as power over others, but as power with and power to transform unjust social structures. This expansion of Ubuntu informs us of the necessity to be freed from all forms of oppression and injustice, be it they are political, racial, economic, gender, and many other manifestations of injustice. We mean to remember power, especially power as often destroyed by these same power dynamics of injustice. I think I wish to draw from my own Anglican heritage and this African philosophy of Ubuntu, which I dare say is in itself a womanist stance type of philosophy. In the Eucharist, we will all know those famous words, "Do this in remembrance of me." The anamnesis in the Eucharist. Rowan Williams says in his book, Being Christian, Baptism, Bible, and Eucharist, he says that in the Eucharist, to remember is not simply to recollect, but to enter into the mystery of God's saving act. We are drawn into the self-offering of Christ, and our identity is shaped in that encounter. Williams then emphasizes the transformative nature of Eucharistic remembrance, of anamnesis. Thus, to remember Christ in the Eucharist is to be remembered for us ourselves, to be remembered into the body of Christ, where the past event of Christ's death and resurrection actually becomes active and transformative for the present day. And as stated earlier, power is in itself neutral yet fluid. But theologically, when we attempt to remember power, we have to allow ourselves to be somewhat drawn into what Christ has done and what Christ is doing and what Christ will do through the Eucharist for humanity. From placing ourselves thus, we are also being remembered, one human with inherent dignity at a time. This then transformed us and our view of power as we ourselves are perpetually engaged in the saving act of grace in the Eucharist that has the power to set us free. And then Stephen Sykes says, the Eucharistic anamnesis is not a solitary exercise, but one in which the whole church participates, calling to mind the redemptive work of Christ, and in doing so, reaffirming its own unity and mission in the world. Thus, remembering is a corporate exercise. It's a communal exercise that requires that we always keep history in our minds, lest we forget our encounters with injustice and fall into the trap of repeating the sins of the past. Remembering power is intricately connected to Jesus' mission in the world, of which is healing the brokenhearted and proclaiming liberty and happiness. And anamnesis, of course, is also a kind of representing, where the person of Christ is made present again. And this presence enables us to recognize the self-emptying of oneself, drawn by love and compassion to set humanity free. Remembering power is no doubt a transformative and active practice. And drawing from the wisdom of those who have gone before us, such as Archbishop Desmond Tutu, we have the capacity to challenge the contemporary issues of injustice towards liberation and wholeness in our lifetime. And we have the responsibility to put to question some of the injustices that we are seeing happening in the church and also happening in our society. Each one of us has the capacity to remember power, remembering our own power with the acclamations of Matla Kiaruna, as we allow ourselves to be remembered into Christ's body and to be reshaped by this remembering. So we see then, perhaps in conclusion, that Tutu, in conversation with Womanist theology, provides us with a new model or some form of model of remembrance, one which is reflected in collective memory and has the power to shape identities. So then, what then is power? What is power, and how are we as South Africans, as seminarians, as priests, as all sorts of people who are in attendance today, how are we exercising our power using this theology of Ubuntu ethics that Tutu has paved the way for us to somewhat remember this body of Christ that Christ calls to a life of fullness, of flourishing, and of fullness of life? I thank you.
Thank you, Seipati. Thank you very much for your presentation, which was both challenging and rewarding to engage with. And the applause from online is echoed by some of the people online with the online applause as well. Thank you for that. As is our norm, then we are going to open the floor. If you have a question, if you can put your hand up online using the online hand, that's fine. We'll keep an eye and see what we can see. and those who are here with me in the Tutu room can do likewise with their physical hands. So we open the floor for questions. If there's any questions, please let us know. And I'll look at my notes to see where I've got my own questions, but let me hold space for some others to come in first, maybe. Do we have any questions from the floor? Well, Seipati, when you were talking, and you talked about how the concept of power coming from this perspective of women's theology and Ubuntu challenges Western notions of individualism and domination as the way to define power. And then you just kind of threw in this verse about following Jesus and taking up the cross. And I think for many of us, that might almost speak of a very individual kind of thing, you know. I've decided to follow Jesus, turn and follow the cross. It sounds a very individual thing at one level. So I wonder maybe if you can unpack that, or maybe have you thought of that as a corporate image? Is that something that you're picking up because you're thinking of it in a different way?
Thank you very much, Dr. May. Yeah, I sort of threw in that verse in there, but I think my focus was to sort of highlight that wherever we see injustices, we have to acknowledge that even those who are committing that injustice are, in a sense, being anti the call of Christ to discipleship, and not necessarily this individual perspective of just taking up the cross, but of a community of disciples that are each called, perhaps in solidarity, to each take up their own crosses and follow. And this is why I also highlighted the whole idea of, you know, Ubuntu does not downplay the fact that people are individuals, but it rather stresses that communal aspect, that nobody is a person in isolation of others. So to take up the cross, I think that invitation by Jesus was actually a very all-encompassing invitation that might call for direct response, but in a very instrumental manner calls for many in a community to take up their cross and follow.
We have thank you. We have a hand online, and we have a question in the chat. So we'll take the hand online, and then we'll look at the question in the chat. Taboho, if you can unmute yourself and ask your question.
Right. Thank you so much. Thank you, Seipati, for that very good and enlightening lecture. You had indicated that Ubuntu, you believe that Ubuntu is a womanist theology. I just would like to know what do you take for granted is womanist theology? What's your background knowledge on the word womanist, so that I can just understand how you link Ubuntu as a womanist theology. Thank you.
May, do you mind if we just take another?
Sure. I think there's at least one question in the chat. So I'm just looking. So there's a question in the chat about the recent rejection of the motion of blessing of same-sex unions at the recent provincial synod. You remind of power that empowers and is aware of the lived experience of people. Would you say that the church is exercising such power? What do you think needs to happen with regard to this matter? And then there's another request to expand on womanist and feminist theology that maybe ties in with Teboho's question.
Yeah, I think I'll take that that one now, especially with regards to womanist and feminist theology, as well as Teboho's question. Oh,
Sorry.
I've said a whole thing. Sorry, I didn't realize I was muted. Yeah, I was just saying that I'll take up Teboho's question alongside Courtney's request for the expansion of womanist versus feminist theology. Maybe just to start by saying, even at the beginning of the presentation, what I was trying to communicate and articulate was that womanist theology premises itself on the lived experiences of Black women. So womanist theology uses this as a starting point, and then from then on builds towards this this notion of liberation, where all people can work towards their own liberation. And it's quite important that we understand that feminist theology, I think, even as from its genesis, was seeking to address primarily women's concerns, but in books such as Sistaki, we see that there was a form of emphasis on the struggles of white women. While the white woman was seeking to be of equal pay with the white men, the Black woman was in the kitchen cleaning after the white woman. So that's just a very basic level type of explanation, but I'm just trying to highlight that it really puts to the fore this missing aspect of Black women's stories that does not show up in a lot of the discourses, such as Black theology of liberation, such as feminist theology. It is centered around these experiences, or these very real lived experiences of Black women. So for me, that is a very instrumental or important distinction between feminist theology and womanist theology. It's the premise, the starting point, or the center. And that also womanist theology does not necessarily view, men as the enemy, but it seeks to work in conjunction with men to build this liberative life and transformative life and flourishing life for all people. So that's how I would respond to Courtney, and I think even Teboho's question, but also to Teboho's question. Yes, I identify Ubuntu as somewhat closely connected to womanist theology. Dare I say, like I said, is womanist theology. And the reason for that is because of the communal aspect of Ubuntu. There is an interrelation that exists in Ubuntu that I think also exists in womanism, by virtue of womanism seeking to not leave anyone out in its discourse. So that's where the similarities are. And then in light of the recent rejection of the motion of blessing of same-sex unions at the Provincial Synod, you remind of power that empowers and is aware of the lived experiences of the people. Would you say that the church is exercising such power? What do you think needs to happen with regards to this matter? Yeah, I think this is a very complicated issue. As you know, Dombi, I was a part of the conversations that happened at Synod. And I think what I appreciated more than anything from Synod was our ability as a church to have these robust conversations and very distinct stances, and be able to come from that room or from that Synod with a sense of still being united. But I don't know what then unity would then mean in the context of such robust distinctions that exist in our own church with regards to human sexuality. So I think that, as I said, that, we have to have a theological lenses that help us to not only reflect on, but critique even our own stances as church and as society. And I think that due to conversation having happened, those who were present representing their own dioceses have unfortunately contributed their say. Whether or not that was just, I think, is another topic. But I think I said to somebody in one of the chats that I think for me, we have to always, you know, I might disagree with you, to paraphrase someone, I might disagree with you, but I will always fight for your right to say what you believe. So I'd like to answer that one in that manner. As to what needs to happen, I think conversation needs to be ongoing, and teaching needs to be ongoing so that we can see how best we can move towards justice.
Thank you, Seipati. Thank you for taking those questions. I thank you. Just looking for any other hands online. I've got 2 different pages. So if you've got if I've missed anyone and you've put your hand down because you were waiting, then now's the time to put it back up. Hands in the room. Hands in the room. Everyone's being very shy tonight. Seipati, I think I have really appreciated what you were saying and how you were tying it both past and future together. And I think what you were saying about the Eucharist tied in quite well with what Nathaniel was saying last week when he was talking about reconciliation, and you came at it from a different angle. But I wonder if we actually think about this power that you're saying, that we basically all have power, and how we actually use it is the question, and whether we use it. And I think often we only think about power when we're on the receiving end of disempowerment, rather than thinking about it positively, as you said. And I think the way you started in talking about the power as linked with Jesus and the disciples and the Spirit, I think just reinforces that kind of positive side of power that you're trying to get us to think about with this idea of remembering power. So thank you very much for bringing those thoughts to us tonight. And we appreciate deeply the time that you've spent with us talking on this. And we hope that it will take us further as we reflect beyond tonight. So thank you again.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. And maybe just as a final thing, I think, you know, sometimes I'm not sure if what I'm trying to communicate is coming through clearly. Excuse me. So I think it's very important, this call of amandla ngawethu, as us understanding that we actually do have power, because the people who raised their fists and, you know, were standing face to face with injustice were actually people who were disempowered, but then they took back the power. And this is why I said earlier, power has to be taken, it has to be used, otherwise it just remains, you know, in an inactive thing that you do not take up. So when we say in situations of injustice, we say, we are actually taking back our sense of freedom, we are taking back our sense of power, and we are engaging power systems that then permits us to contribute to our own liberation, to contribute to our own sense of ushering in justice. So I think that's at the crux of the message, you know, that we all do have power, we all can do something, and it is up to us to take up our own fists in our contemporary issues of injustice and shout likewise, like the people of the past, that the power is ours.
Thank you very much. Thank you everyone for joining us tonight and for being part of the Tutu lectures this year. Watch this space. I'm sure we'll be back next year with more. If you have ideas, suggestions, or you want to be involved, please feel free to get in touch with us here at the college. You can find our details on our website at www.cott.co.za. Thank you to all of our speakers this year, and thank you also to Reverend Canon Janet Trisk, who helped us to organise all of this, and thank you for joining us. Good night.